Greetings. I hope you're having a good Wednesday. Today, as I told you in an email, I'm not going to be on campus. So I posted a couple of resources about our next technical assignment, which is Technical Assignment D. That's called HDR and Panorama. HDR photography has been really popular for a while, and we'll talk about why it's useful and why Lightroom software includes a tab where you can create what's called HDR, high dynamic range photographs. Part of the reason to make an HDR, we talked about in the critique on Monday, is that with a single photograph you have to choose one single exposure, and when you do that you have to choose the part of the photograph that's going to have detail in it. We talked some about how your meter works and how it tries to average everything out to middle gray. Chances are that when you take a photograph, if there's a lot of contrast or there's a lot of difference between the highlights and shadows, you're going to have to choose with your meter whether you want information in the highlights or in the shadows. Sometimes it's difficult to get information in both of those areas when you have a high contrast lighting situation that you get on a sunny day like we have today, for example. I'm sitting in my shed, which is also my office right now. If you look behind me, you'll see a brightly lit window. You'll notice that there's a plastic owl hanging back there and there's a rake, but you can't really see anything outside the window because it's too bright. The camera in this laptop is overexposing what's outside so that you can't see any detail in it. But you can see detail in the shadow areas, which are the wall back there, the water bottles and the tools that are leaning against this wall. You can see detail in those areas because that's what the meter in this computer has chosen to show you. It would be difficult to get detail in both. HDR, or high dynamic range images, allow us to get detail in the highlights and the shadows because instead of just using one exposure setting, we're going to use several. We could use at least 3, sometimes 5 or 7 different exposures. Then we're going to combine all those together, and as a result we're going to get a lot more information in the photograph. In order to help illustrate how this works, I've taken a few examples with my camera, and I'm going to pause this while we take a look at those. The photograph that you're looking at now is a RAW file, and it was exposed using the brightest area of the scene for the meter reading. So what I did was, instead of using an averaging setting for my meter, I used a spot setting so I can measure a small area, and the area that I measured was the sunlight hitting the door outside. As a result, by using those settings, you can see detail in the grass, in the sky, the branches of the tree, the fence in the background. A lot of those areas are lit by that really bright sunlight, and because I exposed for that area, that's where I got detail. When you use manual setting on a camera, you have to very carefully choose which area that you're going to expose for, and you're probably already figuring that out. Again, we talked some about that during a critique on Monday. And a moment ago with the video, when you noticed the window over my shoulder was really bright with no detail, if I would have chosen to expose for that part, then you could see detail there, but I would have been very dark in the shadows, and that's what happened with this exposure. So this is one single exposure. Now in Lightroom, if we're shooting a RAW file, we have a lot of room to edit, and we could still pull up some detail in those shadows, but we run the risk of having noise in those shadows, and we run the risk of not having enough information in those areas to really make it an interesting photograph. So in order to compensate for that, we could make a second exposure to show us the information in the shadows, but then the outside is going to be too bright. Let's take a look at a photo like that. Now for this photograph, instead of metering the outside or taking an average, I metered the inside, the shadow area of the shed. And as you can see, now we have a lot more detail in the shadow areas. So you can see the planks in the ceiling and the objects that are sitting on a table and different things. But of course it is now too bright outside. There's no detail at all in the door. You can't see a place where the door stops and the sky ends, as we would have guessed. Now it's much too bright. So what HDR photography allows us to do is to take these images and blend them together. And instead of just blending two, I want to capture all the detail that I can, and I'm going to blend 5 images together in order to do that. The way that I got these different exposures was by changing the shutter speed on my camera. We'll talk about why in a moment. As I hope you know by now, exposure is a very important topic to us in photography. It's the amount of light that strikes our digital sensor. There are 3 things that control exposure, and we talked about it being like a triangle. Those 3 controls, as you also know, are shutter speed. The shutter opens and closes. It's a time-based control. Aperture, the size of the opening in the lens. It's like the aperture in your eye. And then there's ISO, which defines how sensitive that light-sensitive sensor is, and we can turn it up and down, kind of like the volume knob on a radio. Taking multiple exposures of the same scene using different exposure settings, such as changing the shutter speed, is known as bracketing. And whenever you bracket exposures, it means that you take multiple images instead of just one. And that's what we need to do for HDR photography. Now, if we're going to bracket, we have to figure out which control that we're going to change to get a different exposure. If we change aperture, now we also know that we change what's called the depth of field. So if we bracket using aperture, each one of those photographs we take of the same scene is going to have a different depth of field. So it's going to have a different amount of things in focus from near to far. We're not going to use that for HDR because we want the same visual information as far as sharpness goes. We just want to change how much light we're using to make the image. We also know that if we use ISO as the thing to change when we bracket, we might get different noise levels, because as we turn the ISO up, we get more of what's called digital noise that shows up as sort of like a visual static on your photograph. And we don't want our different exposures to have different levels of noise, because then it's going to be difficult to get rid of that noise once we've processed the photo. The thing that we're going to choose to change in order to bracket photographs for HDR photography is the shutter speed. We're going to slow down the shutter speed to let more light into our scene with each progressive photograph. The problem that could potentially create, as you know, shutter speed is about movement. And if something is moving in the image, if we use different shutter speeds, we're going to have, for one thing, whatever's moving is going to be in a different location in photo 2 than it would be in photo 1. And another thing is we might get blur or movement that we didn't intend on getting within the photograph. In HDR photography, that's called ghosting. And remember that term ghosting, because we're going to deal with that when we actually process that HDR image in Lightroom. So, in order to make this bracket happen with the shutter speed, we have to find a way to keep that camera still, to try to keep it as still as possible without moving. When I made this series of photographs of the shed door, I just took the camera and I leaned it on a stool. It wasn't perfect, and if you look really closely, you can tell that some of the photographs are tilted a little bit slightly different than the others, but it worked well enough that I think we can make an HDR photograph out of it. Another way you could know that the camera was still was to use something like a tripod to hold it into place. If you try to make an HDR photograph just by holding your camera, it's really difficult, and you have to make sure you're as still as possible, because if you're not, as you slow the shutter speed down to let more light into the camera for your exposures, you're probably going to pick up some movement. So that's something to be aware of. Let's take a look at that whole series of images that I shot of that shed door with different exposures. My first exposure, again, was for the brightest area of the scene, which was outside, and also that little beam of light that you can see coming through and hitting floor where the red carpet is. That's where I made my initial exposure reading, and as you can see on the metadata, that was f22 125th of a second at ISO 400. Now what I'm going to start doing in the next photographs is I'm going to slow that shutter speed down. So in this photo I've slowed the shutter speed down one stop, and we talked about what a one stop setting meant. It's a measurement of light. So now I've reduced the shutter speed, or I've increased it to a 60th of a second. Now I'm letting even more light into the camera. I've opened up one more stop to a 30th of a second, slowing the shutter speed down to let in more light for the same scene. And now I'm going to slow the shutter speed down again for this shot to a 15th of a second. As you can see, the information in the shadow areas is opening up, but it's getting really bright outside. So we're going to slow the shutter speed down for the 5th exposure one more time. We're going to slow it down to an 1/8 of a second. Got to make sure we brace the camera to keep it from moving to make the last exposure. Now that we have all those bracketed exposures, we can use Lightroom to put those all together and to blend them into a single HDR high dynamic range image. That looks kind of like this when it's done. So here we have it. This is the finished HDR image, and as a review, what we did was made a series of bracketed exposures. And so at first we metered for the brightest part of the image, and we made an exposure for that. Then we started slowing down the shutter speed by one stop until we got a total, in this case, of about 5 images. It could be more than that, it could be a little bit less, but that allowed us to capture all that information in the highlights and the shadows and to blend it together into what's called a high dynamic range image. This is a lot of times used for kind of a special effect. There are plugins that you can get for photographic software that'll make your HDR images look certain ways, and sometimes it gets really surrealistic. I prefer to just use it as an exposure tool, and it's a problem-solving device. It's a way to get detail all over the photograph so that you don't have any area that's either too bright or too dark. You got a lot of details in there. Great way to record information, and I think they look good. We will be talking about how to do this on class on Monday, and we'll also be talking about how to shoot what's called a panorama, which is a long or a tall photograph, vertical or horizontal photo stitching, and Lightroom also has software that allows you to do that very well. So I will see you guys on Monday, and have a great weekend, and we'll talk a lot more in detail about this stuff. Also, watch the videos that I'm going to provide links for. That'll give you some more insight into this photographic process. It'll give you other people explaining it in a different way, and if you really want to learn something, sometimes it's good to come at it from different angles. I will see you soon. Bye.